be with you. I really appreciate the invitation, the warm welcome, and the opportunity to share. Obviously, leading into Thanksgiving, and so I have a lot to cover. I want to welcome questions throughout, partly because the pace that I'm going to try to do is probably too ambitious for an hour, but I'm going to try to summarize some of the key points and how I get there. This again is the anatomy of school spending effectiveness, going beyond whether money matters toward how, why, when, for whom, and really trying to get a little bit greater causal clarity on at what ages school spending reform is having the biggest impact on student achievement. Using evidence from the California's most recent major school funding reforms that really started in the aftermath of the Great Recession, and the major expansions in public pre-K through the transitional kindergarten program. So one of the things that this particular project and the data partnership with the California Department of Education allowed is for me to access the administrative data records for all public school children in California who've been born since the 2000s, I should say. And so, you know, California has the largest, most diverse state education system. So there's a lot that the kind of being able to have that granularity allows me to kind of speak in ways that my prior work could not in a previous work. So obviously there's a long literature dating back to the Como report that debates whether spending is a major root cause of achievement gaps. You'll often hear people show the significant increase in school spending, and they'll often show aggregated at the state level alongside what looks like stagnant achievement gaps. And, you know, I think it's been clear that that actual aggregation at the state level, but without adjoining it to exactly how the distribution of spending is done, and really tracing out with a causal credible research design that can tease out the impacts of school related factors from family and neighborhood SES. And the other piece is that we do recognize that there may be diminishing marginal returns to education spending. And so there is an argument, right, that even if the prior era had school spending having dramatic effects on future student achievement trajectory, that it may be for contemporary cohorts that those effects are more muted, and that we may be at the part of the production, education production frontier that's flatter. So, you know, those are kind of questions that I'm going to tackle using more contemporary cohorts. And obviously, a lot of the spending disparities are about the adequacy and the progressivity of the state's funding formula. And obviously, New Jersey, with the Abbott rulings, in contrast to Pennsylvania, in the same way one could think about the way Kruger back in the day used it for the minimum wage. You know, people have done that with respect to school spending using Pennsylvania and New Jersey as a contrast. Here, I'm going to focus in on, obviously Pennsylvania I'm highlighting is one of the most regressive state systems where their low-income districts have about a third less spending than their affluent districts, despite much greater need and higher proportion of special needs, English language learners, concentrated poverty, et cetera. So what I'm going to do is focus in on the California experience. I'm going to give you some elements of the highlights of the low control funding formula that was implemented in California, because it's going to be the linchpin through which the research design is going to uncover causal effects. Here, I'm going to basically be using the difference in regression kink design that exploits both the staggered rollout timing of LCFF implementation and the kink in the funding formula at 55% district disadvantage via the state aids concentration grant eligibility cutoff. And I'm going to talk about how I use this within a two-stage least squares instrumental variables framework to estimate causal impacts of spending for each grade and subject. I'm going to show you the distribution of school-specific spending effects for the whole, for every school in California. And I'm going to then link the spending composition from class size to teacher salaries to instructional expenditures teacher turnover, and other dimensions that are connected to what money buys. And then there's a lot of things that I want to say in discussion, but some of that might not make it to 1 o'clock. Okay, so just so that at least you can see where I'm going. I'm going to document positive significant effects of LCFF-induced increases in per pupil spending. I'm going to show and find it for every grade, every subject, and positive effects for every school that experienced this new infusion of state funds. I find impacts on achievement increased with the school age years of exposure and with the amount of increased LCFF funding. I find that dose response led to significant impacts on college readiness, high school graduation rates. I should say that my analysis period is going to focus on the 2013 to 2019 period right before the pandemic. So the 2018-19 school year is the last year before the pandemic. And so I'm going to focus on that period. I find significant narrowing of achievement gaps, significant reductions in student behavior problems, including suspension expulsions, improvements on social emotional development, though that won't make it into this presentation, and positive effects for English language learners. And while I probably won't get to this today, one of the parts of the heterogeneity and the spending effects is connected to what happens before kindergarten, namely that the synergistic effects of transitional kindergarten in ways that it improves school readiness actually cause the increases in school resources in the early elementary school grades to be more efficacious in improving and boosting student achievement. That is, I find large positive effects of this expansion in pre-K access through the transitional kindergarten program that's pronounced for low-income children and evidence in their 3rd and 4th grade reading and math achievement, where we don't find small insignificant TK effect for non-poor children on average. And again, part of that is likely due to their greater access to high quality private pre-K in the counterfactual care setting that often low-income children do not have access. So because I probably won't get to this part, or at least not in full, I just wanted to give you a flavor for where we're headed. We're good? Okay, so again, when we study test scores, obviously you have to figure out ways to put them on a common standardized measure. Reardon et al. Really helped solve this problem to create a standardized measure of test scores using NAEP and indexing it to NAEP and figuring out ways to convert test scores to a single national scale. Because that's not really the innovation that I'm doing, but rather replicating those procedures so that I can convert the test scores to grade level equivalence. In the interest of time, I'm not going to show you the details of that, but it just replicates the same procedures that Andrew Ho, Sean Reardon did in their earlier work that helped produce this figure. For example, this is for the whole universe of public school districts where every circle represents a school district, the size of the circle representing the enrollment size. And you can just see the significant gradient in academic achievement by district socioeconomic status. The most economically disadvantaged districts to the left, to the most advantaged and affluent districts to the right. And I've just highlighted Massachusetts and California in part because Massachusetts has one of the most progressive funding formulas and certainly a high per pupil spending. And prior to LCFF, California was among the 10 lowest in per pupil spending once you account for cost of living. And they had among the biggest academic achievement gap by socioeconomic status in the year leading into. They were in the bottom 10 of states in terms of largest achievement gaps by socioeconomic status. So the point is, you can certainly see that students in Massachusetts, even for the same district socioeconomic status, are performing better relative to California. We just document that the change in the funding formula is a significant component of that, and that narrowed, and that's what we're going to try to document here. So what was the funding formula? What was the change? First, it was a 8-year commitment, totaling an $18 billion commitment that was told to district leaders so that they would know that this funding was guaranteed and that the politics of who was gonna take office in a future election could not undo this. And that really gave them, I think, greater clarity on investing with bolder initiatives than they would have had them it not be sure that it's a long-term commitment. Meaning when states have investments, but they don't commit in a longer time horizon, it tends to affect whether the actual district behavior will invest in instructional expenditures that are reoccurring versus one-time kind of expenditures that are like buildings and capital. You've seen this within the federal pandemic relief, that districts are getting a lot of money right now, but because they know it's temporary, they're not spending it solely for instructional expenditures, mostly for capital one-time expenditures. So that means like how the money spent is that the money is increasing. So this is not targeted district property wealth, but to students. And the property, what is the student disadvantage that the formula is built on? Student disadvantage according to the proportion of district students that are eligible for free or reduced price lunch, English language learners, homeless, or foster youth. The unduplicated proportion of students that fit that set of districts, the funding would then be a function of that. So let me just explain this further. It's targeted to a base grant of $8,000 per pupil, depending on grade level, with a little bit greater funding in the early elementary school grades to keep class sizes lower in the early elementary school grade. A supplemental grant of $1,600 for each high need student, again, defined by the proportion that are free or reduced price English language learner, homeless, foster youth. And then to take into account the significant greater cost of providing equal educational opportunity for concentrated poverty or concentrated disadvantage, they had a concentration grant of $5,300 per high need student for districts that had greater than 55% high need. So the average white student, for example, was in a district that was about 50% district disadvantage, and the average Black student was in a district that was on average about 70 to 75% district disadvantage. And this, I'm just going to try to show you the kind of visual of this gradual rollout of the funding that then I'm going to be using for the difference in regression kink design using this 55% kink. Now, one of the other things it did was it gave greater autonomy to districts to use the money as they found tailored to their district need. And that was something that many district leaders had wanted, to be free from the categorical restrictions on how funding could be used. Now, for this work, I want to account for that, but my focus is on the effect of the spending increase independent of the increased autonomy. So one of the things I just want to highlight is in the lead up to these changes, there was massive hemorrhaging with significant teacher layoffs following the Great Recession. It hit California deeper and harder, particularly for disadvantaged minority communities because of the home foreclosure crisis that accompanied the Great Recession. So without this change, basically that started shifting upward after the low control funding formula. This just shows you in level how big this change was. 2012 represents the last pre-treatment year. 2018 represents the first year at which LCF was fully funded. And then you're seeing the gradual rollout. What I want you to see is there was no kink, and it was a progressive formula, but there's no kink at the 55% in the pre-period. And the kink is very limited until really year 3, okay? And it becomes more, takes hold in subsequent years, okay? So that when you look at it in change form, this is in levels. I'm going to show it to you in change form. That is post LCFF relative to pre LCFF level. This is what it looks like in change form. And this is an example for grades K through 3. And what I want you to think about is what we're going to be doing is, let's say my kids are in Oakland public schools. They're about 70% district disadvantaged. What we're going to be doing is looking at children that are from the same school, before and after, across cohorts from the same school that experience different levels of funding. So you could take a 3rd grader who was already 3rd grade in 2013 and contrast them with a student that turned 3rd grade in 2018. but they're from the same school, but you can see they had vastly different school resource levels. And that's one of the ways I'm going to be trying to do this. But what I want you to also see is that between 0 and 55% disadvantage, there's really no significant progressivity in the funding. Can you see that? So that if you're from the same cohort, there's not really a significant increase, like the level, the intercept is increasing, but if you're from the same cohort, there's really no change going from 0 to 55%. So if there is a causal effect of spending, I'm looking for patterns that are such that within cohort, the pattern is relatively flat through the 55%, and that the change in the growth in achievement is happening precipitously in concert with the increase after 55%. That's what I'm looking for if indeed the spending has a pattern that's consistent with school spending having an effect. Are we okay so far? Okay, so let me just try to move forward. One of the things that my future work is going to also do is that the ESSA reauthorization 2016 had a requirement that spending be also reported for every district at the school level, as well as the traditional district level. And when I first got this data, I was making the case to the Department of Education that they should entrust me with this data because I was going to help them build their information system to link the spending, segregation, integration to outcomes by school to celebrate the kind of positive outliers. That is, these schools that are beating the odds systematically to celebrate the productivity superstars. And the whole design of this is to then show what are the ways in which the spending increasing translate to better outcomes and what are they using the spending on. So the data that I have is the 6.5 million students each year across the K-12 years. I'm able to follow them across all 13 student year observations across the 10,000 schools in California, across the roughly 1,000 districts in California. Remember that the finance data that I'm linking is at the district level and it's inflation adjusted. And I'm first going to focus on the student achievement, math and reading across grades 3 through 8 and 11th grade that are NAEP scale put in grade level equivalents. I'm going to look at high school graduation. I'm going to look at suspension and expulsion, disciplinary behavioral outcomes, and I'm again matching it with the timing of the school finance reforms. Okay, I'm going to basically have school or district fixed effects, right, to account for persistent differences in achievement levels, whether they be observable factors or unobservable factors. I'm going to be including kindergarten cohort effects and account for grade. In the regression kink design, I'm going to account and allow achievement growth to also differ by district percent disadvantage, so that all the identification is driven by the deviation from that average district growth that's coming from the kink in the budget and in the funding that's happening at the 55%. Meaning I'm allowing not only the level of achievement to differ by district characteristics, but the achievement growth on average, that was that baseline, to potentially differ by district percent disadvantage. But what I'm looking for is deviations from that are assumed to not be attributable to anything but the funding because of the way the kink kicks into that additional funding at that level, where other explanations really aren't going to fit this. Okay, and I'm going to try to highlight that. Remember, student achievement attributes are obviously endogenous to these outcomes. Also, because this is such a mammoth investment, the housing and property tax response and parental responses to this funding formula are endogenous. So I'm using a simulated incremental variance approach to keep the wealth and the district percent disadvantage at the 2013 levels, so that I have an instrument that's insensitive to the endogenous behavioral response, where parental responses in terms of moving behavior are not going to be incorporated into this estimate, meaning I'm going to get the causal effect of school spending independent of those kind of family level factors and independent of the change in the autonomy that districts had about how to spend the money. So I'm focusing on this formula, IV, instrumental variables approach to look at the student outcome. Okay, now what I'm only trying to highlight is in the years leading up to the funding formula, these are like children that are older than school age when the reform occurs. I'm looking for like flat here, I'm looking for improvements, but that are a function of the dose. So like if you're a student in Marin or Albany, these are more affluent districts in California that have minimal proportions of student disadvantage, they would get a much, expected to get a smaller bump. A place like LA Unified or a place right, that has a much deeper concentration of poverty, we're expecting to see bigger impacts because not just the duration of exposure, but the dose, because of them having higher proportions of disadvantage. So again, I'm looking at the school spending. I'm going to be hypothesizing that reductions in class size, increases in teacher salaries, reductions in high teacher turnover. Remember, 1 in 5 school children, 1 in 5 public school teachers leave the profession in the first 5 years. But that teacher turnover is like 1 in 2 in high poverty districts. So we're looking at how the spending can also affect and curb some of the teacher turnover, guidance counselors, health services, administrative salaries. These are all the kinds of things that I'm able to look at how the spending is used and and then connected to the student achievement, ultimately mobility, but the mobility part changed after the pandemic. Okay, so I'm focusing on the period before the pandemic. Okay, what I'm going to show you is the results are similar with the difference of regression kink design, where I'm controlling for district percent disadvantage and exploiting only the kink in the formula at 55%. That's simulating the counterfactual funding that would have occurred in the absence of these concentration grants. I'm going to show you similar results of a difference in difference design that uses lagged achievement like 3 years earlier and controls for that as well. I'm going to show you that these placebo tests, where in California, if your local revenue that a district could raise locally was above a certain threshold, they were ineligible for the LTFF state funding because they already exceeded state targets. They could keep the money that they raised locally, but they would not be eligible for LTFF funding. I use them as a placebo check and find insignificant effects for basic aid districts. There's about 125 districts in California that meet that. I find insignificant effects during the pre-LCFF years, meaning I applied this same design, but in the period where before the LCFF was implemented. And then I am able to demonstrate that counter explanations, like the Common Core Standards implementation, like the rebound from the Great Recession, like the change to a new testing instrument, don't account for the pattern of results that I'm about to summarize next. Okay, so I feel like in the interest of time, I'm not going to do this. Okay, so let's not do this, but I promise you, like we have stuff. And I don't want to do that right now. I'm going to just try to show you the visual representation of the research design, mostly because my time is limited. Okay, so I want you to think about the gradients in socioeconomic achievement. It's roughly linear with district disadvantage before LCFF. So it's like the more district disadvantage there is, the lower the achievement. And it's pretty linear with respect to district percent disadvantage. Okay, what I'm going to show you is after this is the visual of the difference in difference pattern. So this is controlling for district fixed effects. This is controlling for statewide common year effects. And this is the change in, say, for example, 5th grade math achievement in grade level equivalence. Now, I want to remind you that we said that within cohort, there wasn't really significant progressivity in the funding formula from 0 to 55. Do you remember that? Again, we find patterns that are similar with no significant improvement in 5th grade math achievement for 0 to 55. That all, this is just a non-parametric visual, all of the improvement in math achievement appears after the 55% and is increasing with the degree of disadvantage. So all of the patterns before this period, more disadvantage is always leading to worse outcomes. Only after the LCFF do we see this type of improvement. This is just showing you the 2018 relative to the 2014 difference. But I want you to see how this looks progressively. So this is 2015 relative to 2014, 2016 relative to 2014, 2017 relative to 2014, and then finally the 2018 relative to 2014. Meaning what I'm trying to say is this doesn't happen overnight. That for any of those years is pretty flat through the 55%. But notice by the time it's fully funded, we're seeing this significant improvement. But in the first year after it was implemented, really nothing significant. It begins to progressively get with that kind of dose response. This is the visual that we see for every grade, for every subject. I'm just showing you for 5th grade. This is kind of just showing you the same thing for 16, 18, 14, okay? Again, if you look at basic aid districts, they weren't eligible for the LTFF funding. We don't see any pattern like that for basic aid districts, okay? There's nothing going on that we see significant in the improvement that we saw for other districts that were eligible for the LTFF funding, okay? Now note, when we look at the earlier period, 2008 to 2012, we not only don't see this uptick in improvement, but there's a widening of the achievement gap in the years leading up to LTFF. So if anything, it's not just that there's a common parallel trends not holding, but the actual pattern is an increasing gap leading up to LTFF, okay? And again, no matter what period you look at before, the pattern is never more disadvantaged leading to improvements in outcome until after LCSS is introduced. Now, what I had been showing you was math. This is for reading. 5th grade reading, again, pretty flat, 0 to 55%. Only the increase after, again, this kink in the funding formula. I'm just showing you the pattern with, average within bin picture. And again, for reading, you can see this progression doesn't happen all at once, but it's a dose response in accord with the dose of how many increase in funding happened and how many years were you exposed. And again, no effects for basic aid districts. So when you put this all together, the key findings, once we put in a 2-stage least squares instrumental variables approach, what we see is that if you experience this funding for 3 consecutive years, I'm talking about a $1,000 increase in per pupil spending experience for 3 consecutive years. So if we're looking at 3rd grade, I'm talking about you got a $1,000 increase in spending in 1st grade, in 2nd grade, in 3rd grade. The average effect is a full grade level improvement in math. So if they were a grade level behind in the prior cohort, after this was implemented, they're now at grade level, a full grade level improvement. And we're not just seeing it for 3rd grade, we're seeing a consistent pattern across all the grades in math, including 11th grade. Okay, now what I'm only suggesting here is that I have to remember what points I need to make sure I'm clear on. Okay, I'll see design, 3 years. In other words, I want the design to pick up the fact that it's not just about your level of resources in the year that achievement is measured, but rather how many years did you experience that successive increase in per pupil spending? And this $1,000 increase is within the window or range that students experience. And we see this both for math and reading. So again, this is for reading, but when I look at a thing like 8th grade achievement, I'm talking about experiencing a $1,000 increase in 6th grade, in 7th grade, in 8th grade. I'm talking about throughout your middle school years, children from the same middle school, across cohorts that experience this $1,000 increase throughout their school age years, in contrast to children from the same school, but for cohorts that predated this implementation, okay? And most of these places that got the money, they're mostly very high poverty, high levels of disadvantage, as I said before. So we're seeing that. I want to just remind you that when we do the 2-stage least squares approach, applied to basic aid district, not in math, not in reading, right? And this just is showing you with confidence in both the pattern across every major demographic group to show you the spending is having an effect on all of the students that it's hitting. Low-income students. This is low-income students math. This is low-income students reading. Again, it's about a whole grade level difference, okay, on average, Black kids. significant, right? About 10 to 11 months of reading and math improvement. Hispanic kids, same big, pattern. Look at students who qualify for kindergarten English language learner services in kindergarten. Again, same significant relationship and of the same magnitude. Okay, now all of this then translated into significant improvement in high school graduation rates, particularly for students from lower income backgrounds. You can see this dose response is such that in the years leading up to LCFS, it's relatively flat. If you were like a place like Marin County, again, if you were low income, but you were in Marin County, because Marin County is relatively affluent, you're low income, but the district itself is pretty affluent. So you're kind of more like this yellow line because you've got relatively less funding. But your otherwise family characters were similar. For a district that was much higher poverty, say Oakland and other kinds of districts, you're seeing the large spending increase translate into about a 5 percentage point increase in the likelihood of graduating from high school associated with being exposed to this higher funding throughout your high school year. So if you were only in experiencing this level of increase in spending, but it only happened in 11th grade, or it only happened in your senior year of high school, right? Then we see much more muted effects. So when you look at the three, this really represents a student where the actual exposure to the spending happened throughout their high school years. And you're seeing that dose response. Now, I should say, we think that high school graduation is kind of a crude instrument. It's kind of in an earlier era, high school was like a better barometer of the quality and success of a school, but it's really about college readiness in this era. So when we look at college readiness, what we see is in the pre-LCFF period, the college readiness, like this is just an example by race. And this is basically what led in part for the California system to no longer require the SAT and ACT, in part because the 11th grade college readiness markers were more predictive of college success than the SAT and ACT. So here I'm using these same markers, and you can see that for the average Black and Latino student, roughly half of them are not meeting neither the math or reading college readiness standards. For Asian and non-Hispanic white, you're seeing those rates 20% and 25% for non-Hispanic white. So really dramatic differences by race, ethnicity, and the college readiness of meeting math and reading. And all of the UC system uses these benchmarks to try to target who is admitted, okay? And I just want you to see, it's not just race, ethnicity, but if you look at it by socioeconomic disadvantage, this is low income, this is non-poor kids, this is English learners, right? You can see that this same like 50% of low income kids, right, are roughly half of low income kids are not meeting either the math or the English language learner standards. This is prior to LCFF. Now, what we then show is after this implementation of LCFF, okay? We find that $1,000 increase in spending experienced in 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, right? Throughout your high school years, we're seeing it translate into a 7.6 percentage point increase in the likelihood of meeting math college readiness standards, and a roughly 9.1 percentage point increase in the likelihood of achieving college readiness standards in reading. Now, I've been talking a long time. And, as an economist, I'm a little uncomfortable with like, I don't know what you're thinking at this point, but I need you to be with me. Are we still okay? All right. So I'm saying the college readiness, we're seeing the same pattern across the entire spectrum of 3rd grade through 11th grade into the college readiness. Now, at this point, we really want to understand heterogeneity in what did schools spend the money on? And are there particular patterns of spending behavior on the part of district that are associated with better outcomes for kids? That's which types of spending are most effective? That's the next question. And so we want to kind of think about a framework for thinking about heterogeneous treatment effects according to 3 dimensions of heterogeneity. The first is really the treatment contrast, which is kind of what I've been talking about to this point, which is some places got funding of different levels, and the services received by the treatment group, the counterfactual funding received had the policy not been in place, and there's like a dose response that's related to the exposure years and the type of district in terms of how much money they were eligible for from LCFF. We've kind of focused on that, but now we want to look at how does it differ by student characteristics and how does it differ by school context, meaning places that have a higher proportion of English learners, places that have a greater degree of segregation by race or class. How does that affect the effectiveness of the spending in addition to what the spending was used for? Those are the kinds of things we wanted to analyze. I'm trying to think about how I want to describe this. Okay, so what I want you to think about is here, I'm just going to give you an example of the difference in different designs is yielding the same results as the difference in regressing kink design. I'm going to just try to describe the difference in different design, which is basically, let's say 6th grade student achievement is the outcome here. So I got 6th grade achievement. I'm going to control for the 3rd grade achievement. So if I'm looking at 2 children that have the same 3rd grade achievement, the only difference is that this instrumented per pupil spending is the average per pupil spending in 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, controlling for their baseline 3rd grade achievement. Okay? And again, I got school fixed effects, that's the thetas. I got kindergarten cohort fixed effects, that's the theta B. I got some other controls, but the main point is these pieces are doing the work, okay? Now, what I want you to see is here though, notice the beta coefficient has a subscript S, meaning I'm wanting to get an estimate for every school of what their school spending effectiveness was for that same $1,000 increase in spending. I want to like decompose that for every school, okay? So to do that, right, what I had been showing you before was the big beta, but not allowing each school or district to have a separate coefficient. So again, I'm nesting this within a multi-level random coefficient model where I'm allowing the beta coefficient on the spending effectiveness within a 2-stage least squares, instrumental variables framework, all that still the school fixed effects, the year fixed effects, all that still is like it was before. But now I'm allowing me to get an estimate of the average effective increase in per pupil spending on student achievement, but I'm getting now an estimate. The tau is the between school standard deviation in the school specific spending effect. And that is going to allow me to, I'm going to get these empirical Bayes estimates to get the shrunken estimate that's taken into account potential measurement error. And then I'm going to be trying to then examine how much of the distribution of that spending effect do we see. Now, what I'm going to then do is save all of those estimates from all of those betas, okay? So that I have a beta S, which is the school specific impact, okay? I'm going to save those so that I can show you the histogram of those beta coefficients of the effects of $1,000 increase in spending, okay? And then there's some details that I have to do that are about the shrunken Bayes estimate versus like the adjusted empirical Bayes estimate. But for our time, let's not talk about that, okay? So what I want you to kind of think about though is this beta coefficient about the effect of LCFF induced increases in funding on student achievement. What I'm then going to do is, in the same way that I have that beta estimate of the effectiveness of each school's spending, I'm then going to do the same thing, but instead of the outcome being student achievement, I'm going to allow the outcome on that side to be what they spent the money on. Each school in each district. So I'm going to have a gamma 1 that school spent that much of the spending on class size reduction, that much of the spending on teacher salaries independent of class size, that much of the spending on building and capital expenditures, and the list goes on. And so the idea here is in this stage of the analysis, the beta S is my outcome of interest. This represents the average effect that school had in its per pupil spending effectiveness. But it's going to then be estimated as a function of each school inputs that change as a result of the LCFF funding formula change. So right now, gamma 1 adds, gamma 2 adds, gamma 3 adds, but this might be like class size, teacher salary, the vector goes on. The major school input that all the literature has described as one of the key observable dimensions about why money matters, what school inputs matter. So I'm then doing all of that so that I can then get an implied R squared of how much of these observable things can account for this beta S, this difference in the heterogeneity of the effectiveness of the school spending. So let me just show you visually. Okay, this is the histogram of the beta S. That is, this is the distribution of school-specific spending impacts in grade level equivalents. The first thing I want you to know is this is 0. So I'm just telling you, I'm not like singling Air Canyon Check out or anyone else, but I'm just saying the people who said it doesn't matter, the distribution for schools is shifted to the right of 0. The central tendency is, as I said, almost a full grade level. And are there places where it's even more than that? Yes. Are there places where it's half a grade level? Yes, but half a grade level, that's a big difference. I would say half a grade level might even be bigger than a lot of results I've seen to date. So if anything, I'm trying to figure out how my results can be this big. But I've done everything to get them to go away. They do not go away. They're extremely resilient. My main point is this histogram suggests that not just money matters, there is some heterogeneity, but the overlying piece is we're seeing this is 6th grade math. Again, controlling for 3rd grade math. This is like a 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, $1,000 increase in 3 consecutive grades, holding constant their 3rd grade achievement. So it's like looking at 2 children, same 3rd grade achievement. Only difference is what happened in 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade in the spending. Okay. Similarly, this is for 8th grade math achievement. Again, very few, if any, districts to the left of 0, central tendency close to 1, full grade level improvement. And when I decompose, that is, I'm doing this in a multi-level framework where I'm allowing the school and district random effects so that I can decompose how much of the spending effectiveness differs between districts versus between schools within districts. In other words, the intra-district resource distribution is something that's often overlooked and often not able to be analyzed directly. Here, which is a little surprising to me, almost actually a full half, right, of the per pupil spending effects vary between schools within districts. So when ESSA has this new requirement of having schools report the school spending at the school level, you can see the value of that. Now, I'm not able to do that here. So all of my spending is at the district level because I don't have reliable school level spending that goes far enough back to feel confident. But I'm just saying in my future efforts, that's what I'm going to be doing. But what I'm only saying is this average spending effect, half of it is within intra-district, right? Half of it is between district. That's for 6th grade math. For 8th grade math, again, 60% is between district in terms of the effectiveness. But you can see almost 40%, right? 38.5% is between schools within district. Okay. Now, again, I would say this is like similar to Oakland public schools in this particular way, that I live in the hills. The hills of Oakland are very affluent. They're very highly educated families. And in the lower part of Oakland, right, it's a lot higher poverty concentration. And so the between school within district is in part because there is significant compositional heterogeneity even between schools within the same district. We're picking some of that up, I believe. But what I want you to see is this same distribution for reading. This is 6th grade reading. Again, very few to the left of 0, if any, central tendency like this. You can see that are there schools where it's about half of grade level improvement? Yes, but that's still very big. And similarly for 8th grade reading achievement, okay? And again, for reading, it's about half, 40, 50, about half are of that variation. And the effectiveness is between schools within districts. And, it's that same kind of pattern I said before. Now, in the interest of time, I just want you to hear the summary of the models that then try to analyze what kind of spending is associated with the higher betas, the more effective spending. What type of inputs? Well, we find in a kind of implied R-squared, which is actually extraordinary that this amount of the beta coefficients could be associated with observables. Because usually if you think about the research on teacher quality, we know teacher quality matters, but then if you look at what observable correlates of teachers like master's degrees or, experience, like it's weakly associated with the teacher quality. So it wouldn't actually surprise me if I was unable to, with observables, capture a lot of the dimensions of the school spending effectiveness. This is not that. I'm actually able to account that class size, teacher salary, teacher turnover, guidance counselor, health services, teacher professionalism. These 5 characteristics, and particularly the first 3 that I'm putting under the umbrella of instructional spending, comprise the lion's share. We're talking upwards of 84% of the implied R squared is associated with spending on those things. If they spent it on capital expenses like buildings, it's not that that's not valuable, particularly in the pandemic where there's, outdated ventilation systems that are like, make a lot of children vulnerable for contagions like COVID that need to be overhauled. But when they spend it on that, it doesn't directly affect student achievement. So we don't see like those kind of expenditures being game changers on student achievement, which isn't surprising. If there is a lot of what we call pension debt in the system, that they use some of the increased spending to kind of address some of the accumulating pension debt. Again, that doesn't make it to the classroom. It's not surprising that that's not highly associated with student achievement. All I'm saying is where there are inputs spent that don't really make it to the classroom, we don't really see a lot of movement. But when it's spent on things like the ones that I'm listing here, we're seeing a lot of traction. That again is affirming not just resources matter, but when the resources are very student-centered, they are affecting outcomes in a significant way. Now, it's important that you understand we are doing this not just on test scores, even though that's been all of what I've shared to this point. We look at and show significant reductions in student behavior problems, same research design, but I'm using annual incidents of school disciplinary incidents, grades 3 through 11, and I'm going to just highlight the disproportionate impact it has for Black boys. This is for all boys, and this is for all grades. And this is just showing you about a 3 percentage point reduction in the likelihood of being suspended or expelled in a given year. Again, where the treatment here is a $1,000 increase in per pupil spending. Okay? This is boys, but this is Black boys. Okay? Now, what I just want you to see is this is like obviously the levels of expansion and expulsion, the disproportionality of Black boys being represented with disciplinary incidents is well documented. But what I'm just documenting here is how the school resource environment actually affects those. Okay, we're talking about a 9 percentage point reduction in the elementary and middle school years. And again, most pronounced in high school, right? A 12 percentage point reduction in the annual incidence of suspension and expulsion. Now, for these analyses, I don't include LAUSD, primarily because LAUSD had a very different policy that predated LCFF that changed their entire, now I wouldn't say they were implementing restorative justice practices because they were not doing that, but they did have a change in policy that makes them not fit the kind of parallel trend assumption for reasons that I don't want to get into now. But this is girls. Again, girls often have, minuscule, more acting in, say, boys are acting out, girls more acting in. So you don't really see, those that pronounce, but for Black girls, it's still, right, a sizable reduction. We're talking about a 5 percentage point reduction in high school. Okay, so again, looking beyond test scores, we examine improvements on social emotional development that our indices are on self-management, growth mindset, self-efficacy, social awareness. I don't have time to summarize those right now. And then we went some ways further to try to use these estimates to stimulate from models adult outcomes based on these results, because we couldn't go further because of the pandemic. I think in the interest of time, what I'd like to do, if you can just give me like 5 minutes and then I'll just stop. I just want you to, this is like a different paper, but it's part of the same project. And the reason it is important in this context is that the heterogeneity in school spending effectiveness is a very important part, but people usually focus on the K-12 years as the source of the heterogeneity. And I just want to highlight that actually what happens before kindergarten shapes much of the actual subsequent effectiveness of the spending increase. Here, I'm now marrying 2 designs. One was the LCFF. Now I'm talking about the rollout conditional kindergarten. Transitional kindergarten is like a universal pre-K, but with curricular alignment with the kindergarten Common Core standard. It's a more academically oriented approach relative to, say, Head Start. It's less play-based. That could have some downsides. I'm not suggesting it doesn't. I haven't analyzed that yet. But the main point I want to highlight is that we're going to be using a regression discontinuity using the age at which you're eligible. That is, it's about your birth date cutoff. And the birth date cutoff for the California State Preschool Program, that's for 3-year-olds. The kindergarten cutoff for eligibility as a 4-year-old. The kindergarten cutoff for transitional kindergarten. We're going to be using that as the identification strategy. So let me just show you what it looks like visually. So our daughter, our youngest child, our daughter, she was maybe in the 3rd cohort of transitional kindergarten because she has a late birthday. The way it works in the first year, if you were December 3rd, if you were born after December 3rd, you had to wait to enter kindergarten. If you were a November birthday, November 1st to December 2nd, you were now newly eligible for what they call a 2-year kindergarten experience. The first year, transitional kindergarten, and then the second year, you'd be in the same cohort as these children. These are all going to be entering kindergarten cohorts together. But this group would have been eligible for transitional kindergarten. And you can see the take-up is roughly 2/3, or roughly 60% of those eligible took it up. And we don't really see significant differences by low income class. It's roughly 60% for both. Okay, what I'm going to then do is use this regression discontinuity design. Are we clear on the design? To this side, you're not eligible, for this side, you are. And then I'm going to be examining 3rd grade, 4th grade. I'm going to be looking for the same discontinuity. Okay, now, again, the idea, right? School readiness, the curricular alignment, all of these same kinds of things. I don't want my time to be bad. Okay, so I'm going to just say it orally. Sorry. Okay, now let's do this. Okay, so this is 3rd grade reading achievement, for example. Again, remember on this side, they're not eligible for TK. On this side, they're eligible. But what I want you to see is I'm going to marry the RD, the regression discontinuity, with what kind of school and how well resourced was their elementary school. So I'm going to use the same LTFF design to get exogenous variation in the school spending environment and contrast it with the places that were less well funded. Okay. Now, what I just want you to see is this is 3rd grade achievement. So, relative to children that were on this side of the cutoff, narrow bandwidth. Okay. We're seeing that children that went to schools, low-income children that went to schools that were better resourced, had a bigger discontinuous jump, a bigger improvement in their achievement. So we're seeing TK matters on average, but it matters a lot more if they went to better funded elementary schools. Again, school fixed effects, statewide trends. I'm just using only the age cutoff for TK eligibility. I'm only using the regression kink design for the funding change. Okay, and I just want you to see that difference. We see that not only in reading, okay, but we also see that for non-core kids that typically had access to quality private pre-K on average, we don't see a significant jump. Now, I wouldn't say that's a non-effect. I would say that's good news, because what that says is they switched from quality private pre-K to a public provided program, and they didn't see any diminishment in their outcome. Meanwhile, maternal employment patterns increase. Meanwhile, lots of high cost private pre-K was not have to be spent, and they could actually get within a socioeconomic diverse, more diverse, I would say, public pre-K program. Now, I'm just saying, this is not a non-effect that you should say, it doesn't work for non-poor kids. That's not what you should think, in my view, okay? But what I am saying is for low-income kids who don't have the access to quality pre-K, when it's not publicly provided often, we're seeing for math achievement, not only does the TK matter on average, but if they attend a better funded early elementary school grade, bigger subsequent changes.